Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Melinda Treadwell. I'm the president here at Keene State College, and I'm privileged to be here with you this afternoon. And we are so appreciative that we have a national correspondent, international correspondent with NPR, Jason Beaubien, who's here with us today. And we very much are appreciative for the opportunity to be with you, Jason. We thank you for your work. And I'm going to turn this over for this important time with you today to Kate DeConnick, director of our Cohen Center here at Keene State College, for formal introductions and to get us right into the webinar. So thank you so much, Kate. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for the warm welcome to today's event, President Treadwell. My name is Kate DeConnick, and as she was saying, I'm the director of the Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College. And today's event, Reporting on War, is also a co-sponsored offering. So we drew together multiple partners across campus: the Cohen Center, the Dean's Office, the Departments of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Political Science, and Journalism, Media, and Public Relations. As a group, all of the organizers share a commitment to the public liberal arts mission of Keene State College, and we also believe that conversations like today's can help to create an active, informed citizenry, both domestically and internationally. So we'd like to thank all of you in the audience for joining us today. We also want to offer a special word of thanks to Michelle Kiawa, Dr. Chad Nye, Dr. Kim Laffer, and Paul Miller, who have each played different roles in helping to make today's event what it is. So thanks to those individuals in particular. And we're delighted today to be hosting a conversation with Jason Beaubien, who is a Peabody Award-winning journalist and a global health and development correspondent with National Public Radio. Jason has filed stories from more than 60 countries, and he regularly writes about natural disasters, wars, and human conflict. Jason has covered earthquakes in Haiti, the Arab Spring, the drug war in Mexico, and as we'll be talking more about today, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Those of you who have had a chance to view Jason's NPR profile will know that he has recently posted stories about deadly missile strikes, attacks on energy infrastructure, and just days ago, Russians pull out from Kherson. One of Jason's greatest gifts, in my estimation, is his ability to address both large-scale developments in the war, as well as the effects of these events on families and communities. So what I appreciate most about Jason's reporting is his ability to capture the broader dynamics of global conflict without losing sight of the local realities and individuals' lived experiences. So in just a moment, I'm going to hand the Zoom mic over to Jason, who will share a few introductory remarks with all of us. And after that, I'll be inviting each of our 4 panelists for today to ask Jason a question. We're lucky today to be joined by 4 leaders at Keene State College, each of whom has a particular interest in Jason's work. So Tom Benoit is an undergraduate student majoring in journalism. Tom is the managing executive editor of The Equinox, which is our student-run newspaper on campus, and he's previously interned with the Keene Sentinel as well as Bend Magazine, The Bend Magazine. And our next panelist is Dr. Elisa von Jordan-Forgy, who is endowed chair and graduate program director in the Department of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Holding expertise in areas such as genocide prevention, gender and genocide, and race and imperialism, Elisa is also the co-president of the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention. We also have with us today Dr. Phil Barker, who is chair and associate professor of political science. Phil teaches courses on international relations and comparative politics, and his academic research focuses on the role of religion in national identity and conflict. And he is also the host of a popular podcast called The Politics Lab. And our 4th and final panelist today is Giulio Del Sesto, who is chair and professor of journalism, media, and public relations. A Keene State graduate himself, Giulio serves as advisor to the Equinox and was also the recipient of the college's Distinguished Teacher Award in 2022. And some of you might have also seen Giulio in his role as the new co-host of a NH PBS documentary series called Sidetrack. So after our four panelists have each had a chance to ask Jason a question, we're going to use the rest of our remaining time today to address any questions from our audience members. So we would invite you in our audience to use the Q&A feature in this webinar to submit questions for consideration. And you can submit questions at any point in time, either while we're speaking, while Jason is speaking, during the panelist Q&A. All that we ask is that you please keep your questions both concise and respectful. And we will attend to as many of those questions as time will allow. But out of respect for everyone's time, we do plan to end this session and the webinar at the 1 hour mark as scheduled. We also just wanted to remind our audience that Jason is joining us live today from Ukraine, where rolling electrical blackouts are pretty common. For what I understand, Jason might tell us more about this, but he's been in Kherson all day today, and there have been a few logistical challenges along the way. So he's going to be joining us for the first part of this event through his phone, and then he'll transfer over to his laptop when he arrives back at his lodging. So we know that our audience members will be graciously understanding if we do face any interruptions in our communications during this event as a result of those conditions. Okay. So thanks to all of you. And now with that, it's my absolute pleasure to turn things over to our guest today, Jason Beaubien. Jason, thank you so much for joining us today live from Ukraine.
Oh, thanks a lot, Kate. I really appreciate it. And I'm in the back seat of our car. We're on our way back to the hotel. We started the day at 4 a.m. this morning. It's 7 o'clock here, p.m. now. It's been a long day, but we were in Kherson all day, which was really amazing just to see this city that was pretty much liberated in a matter of days. So it was quite exciting. And on top of that, President Zelensky showed up with a surprise visit. So it was definitely a worthwhile trip. I really wanted to start by talking a bit about just how this war has changed over the most recent months. And I'm hoping people could see that first map that I had, which was showing how much territory Russian forces had occupied at the end of March. And when you look at this, you can see in the east of Ukraine, this red that stretches from Crimea up through Kherson, over towards the east along the border of Russia, and up into Kharkiv and up above Kyiv as well. The actual capital is almost surrounded when you look at that map. And so that's what the situation was pretty much when Russia had as much control as it ever did over the country. And now if we could switch to the current map, which is from last week, and I have to say that last week's map is even out of date, you'll see how much territory Ukrainian forces have managed to pull back from Russian control. It's really quite impressive. All of that red that was up around Kyiv on the north part of the country is gone, as well as around Kharkiv, which would be further to the east of that. And now, as I said, this map as well is outdated, and that just over the weekend, Ukrainian forces managed to reestablish control in Kherson, which is on the left side of the Dnipro River. And the Dnipro River is the largest river in Ukraine, starts up in the capital and runs all the way down. So it's like block by block, Ukrainians are pulling back territory. And it's really quite impressive, I think, when you look at these two maps. I hope to get a chance to just answer the questions that you really want to ask me. I'm somewhat in the weeds here because this is my 5th trip to Ukraine. I've been doing this since right after the Russian invasion. But I think that this is an incredible story of our time. I think this is a historical conflict that is happening at the moment. And I feel honored to be able to be here and document what's happening. So with that, I'd like to just, as I say, open it up so that we get a chance to really answer the questions that you all have the most and take it from there.
Jason, would it be okay while we're sharing the screen just to scroll through some of the images that you had shared with me for the audience to see?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and I can tell you a little bit about them as we're going through. This is a Russian a tank that was destroyed. This is from the last trip when I was here, and it's actually in the Kharkiv region. The fighting in the east and the south, here's the south and around Kherson, has been quite different. It's interesting. It's sort of been more of a slow, steady pressure that Ukraine has been putting on the Russian forces in the south. And in the east, a lot of it was really brutal fighting, very close combat, and that continues. When we look at some of the fatality numbers coming out, the fatality numbers are much higher in the east, which just demonstrates the degree to, how brutal some of that warfare is that's going on in that part of the country. This is actually a shot of what was a humanitarian aid facility just north of Kharkiv, and the Russians managed to hit it directly with a cruise missile and blew it up. And there was this child's shoe lying there. In the background, you can see this building that was completely destroyed. They did that in the middle of the night. Fortunately, no one was killed in that, but it was a place that was the center of distributing food, distributing aid, distributing blankets, distributing other basic necessities that people need. And this is something that we see over and over here. It's clear that the Russians are at times targeting military facilities, but there is a lot of civilian infrastructure, apartment buildings, things that clearly have no military significance that are being blown up with cruise missiles, being blown up with artillery, being blown up with shelling. It's something that we just see day in and day out. This is actually the administrative building for Mykolaiv, which is here in the south, and it was struck right after 9 a.m. This was fairly early in the war, directly into the office of, it basically is the governor. After the war, they've switched their titles to being the regional military administration, but it basically hit his office and just tore that building apart. But they're not back working out of that building, but as you can see, they've got the flag flying again out front. This is some just photos of me out working, doing what we do. On the left, I was working on something just about how some of the fields have just been left completely uncultivated in areas where there's a lot of conflict, which is a significant issue because Ukraine is very much an agricultural nation. Is a huge part of Ukraine is agriculture, and in many of the places that have been occupied, many of the places that are where there's conflict, things just aren't growing. You have fields that are that used to be sunflower fields, and now they're just full of weeds. And then this other photo on the other side is right next to the Kyiv railway station, the main railway station in downtown Kyiv. It was October 10th, Monday, October 10th, in retaliation for the Crimea bridge blowing up. Russia launched these missile strikes all across the country, including striking this office building, which was just an office building, and it was close to the train station. It was also close to an electrical plant, and it's just another example of oftentimes these strikes that Russia does with cruise missiles that are sometimes coming all the way from the Caspian Sea. They come flying in and they don't hit what their intended target was, and often hit things like this, like an office building. This is Kharkiv at a time when people were still sleeping in the subways. Early on, Kharkiv is in the northeast of the country, and early on, it was just slammed with missiles, and fighter jets, troops came right up into the outer edges of the city. Kharkiv suffered immensely in the very early days of the war, and many people moved into the subway stations. And this was in June. People were still sleeping in the subway stations at that point, and it was kind of amazing, you know, that people would tell me one of the most difficult things was that they never turned the lights off. They were underground. They were in this fluorescent lit environment, and there were thousands of people living in the subway system in Kharkiv. And this, I'm getting a little bit of a theme here, but this was a shopping mall, which was right next to an industrial plant. And one missile struck the industrial plant. The other missile struck a shopping mall in the middle of the afternoon. I can't even remember how many people were killed, but you know, this just again, this is part of what is going on day in and day out. You're getting attacks on, you know, what people back at the Kremlin might argue are legitimate military targets, yet more often than not, we're seeing things like shopping malls, apartment buildings, being blown apart, and civilians being killed. This is a very interesting story. There's a place in Zaporizhia where people who are attempting to come out of many of the different occupied territories end up at they call it the epicenter, which is what it says there in the background. It's basically like a Home Depot. But there's been this route of people trying to escape from the occupied territories, and the routes just end up always funneling them up through Zaporizhia, and people end up in this big parking lot. And there was this woman there on this day with her dog. But every day, every time we've gone there, and other correspondents from NPR have gone there as well, every day you have dozens, potentially hundreds of people who are trying to get out of the occupied territories, and they end up getting funneled back into Ukraine and into services here through this parking lot. And in the tent behind there's a place where people are handing out food and coffee.
All right. So Jason, thank you so much for sharing those images with us, just so we could show them to our audience. You know, between you being on the go and then us getting to see the images, it really makes us collapse the distance in a way. You know, it feels like from where we are to where you are. So thank you for sending those to us ahead of time. That was perfect. Would you like to get right into the kind of Q&A portion now with our panelists? Does that sound good?
No problem at all.
Perfect. And I think there's a slight lag, Jason. I think you might be arriving at your destination. Can you still hear us okay? Okay, I think this is the moment where Jason is transferring over probably from his phone to his laptop. So we're just going to give him a minute. That was actually perfect timing because we just finished looking through his images. So thanks to all of you for your patience. But let's get the spotlight onto all of our panelists now so that we are ready for our Q&A when it's time to begin with that. Great. Good. And Jason has rejoined us. Good. Jason, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can. I'm sorry. We did just pull up to the hotel. So I'm walking in the door right now.
That's okay. I was just saying you're probably
up.
transferring.
Yeah, we're just transferring from one place to another. Thank you very much.
Of course. Yeah, would you like us to give you a minute to get settled before we jump into the next part? I think it's still a little choppy.
This way. So you can see my hotel. It's actually, I mean, Odessa is a beautiful city, has beautiful hotels. This place is this gorgeous old place that I'm staying in. It's kind of crazy to go from a place where people have no water or electricity in Kherson, and you come back here and it's, yeah, just a modern hotel. People are, yeah, they're living, and this is a very interesting thing in Ukraine. You have some people who are living, yeah, almost very normal lives, right? For the most part, life goes on. And you have other people, like people in Kherson, who, yeah, are really struggling. Sorry, one more thing. Who are really struggling. Yeah, don't even have the basics. You know, people were coming into Kherson today simply to get access to Wi-Fi hotspots that the Ukrainian military is setting up, you know, in the middle of the town. So I'm going to switch over to my laptop, but I will keep this open if you want to move over to someone else really quickly, and then I will be back with you in hopefully 2 minutes.
Okay,
here.
that sounds
Okay.
great. Yeah, no rush. We know you're dealing with a lot today, so we're just grateful for your time and your presence with us.
No problem.
But great. Yeah, so I think, Tom, as soon as Jason's kind of settled, we're going to go to your question first. So we'll kind of let him transfer over. And just a reminder to our audience members who might just be joining us, but Tom is one of our undergraduate students here at Keene State, majoring in journalism, and is also one of the editors of the Equinox, our student-run newspaper. So we're excited to have him as part of our conversation today. Good. All right, so Jason, you let us know when you're ready, and then we'll give Tom the floor to ask his question.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm going to keep it going on my phone as I attempt to connect on my laptop, which I think will be a slightly better connection. So go ahead.
Great. Well, first, thank you so much for joining us today. My question is, I guess, what is it like communicating with editors and other members of the NPR team while covering conflicts like this?
You know, it can be complicated at times. Are you hearing me okay now? Just want to make sure. Okay, just want to make sure. Yeah, it can be complicated at times. We use WhatsApp as a communication tool, and it works incredibly well, in part because you don't need a lot of bandwidth. Just today, as a matter of fact, in Kherson, the Ukrainian military, basically, so it's interesting. So the Russians cut off the occupied territories from access to Ukraine or the West. All communications went through Russian, and continue in the occupied areas, through Russian cell phone networks, Russian internet, and people couldn't communicate with their loved ones. So when the Russians pulled out, they actually destroyed the electrical system and shut down all of those cell towers. So the Ukrainian military has come in and put up these Starlinks, which is a Elon Musk project, and they were Starlinks that had Wi-Fi. There were Starlinks that were actually connected to some of the cell phone towers, and they were running the cell phone connection through I don't know exactly how this worked, but it was kind of amazing. And all these people were coming in to communicate, and for us as well, we would use the Wi-Fi from that, as well as WhatsApp, which is takes very little bandwidth to communicate. Sometimes it can be a little frustrating communicating because of the time difference. You know, I'm 7 hours off from the East Coast. We do have editors. We have one who works out of Amman, Jordan. We have another one who works out of Southeast Asia. And oftentimes it's like, so tomorrow morning, I'm going to be on Morning Edition tomorrow. That story I will not write until I wake up tomorrow, and I will edit it with someone before Morning Edition's editors come in at 4 a.m. your time. So oftentimes we're juggling these time differences, which is, I think that's probably the hardest thing. Those two things: one, not having communication at all, and number two, just trying to work with people when we're in this completely different time zone. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
For that question. Yeah.
Great. Let's go over to Elisa next, our chair in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. What would you like to ask of Jason today?
Thank you so much, Kate. And thank you so much, Jason, for being here with us. It's really a delight to have you here and to have you zooming in from so far away when you're also in harm's way. So thank you. I want to ask you as a genocide scholar, so I have a two-part question based on my role as a genocide scholar. One is based on my experience when I was in Iraq. I was in Iraq during the war against ISIS in the war zone, and witnessing atrocities committed against various communities there. And, you know, I remember it was a very jarring thing to realize that the war zone was also a massive crime scene. And back then, we didn't have actually the same tools operative around the world to collect evidence. And so there was all this evidence just lying out there, mass graves and such, with no security and no evidence collection teams. And, you know, IDPs, internally displaced people, were collecting their own evidence and doing their own interviews. And so I want to ask you, the first part of my question is, how do you see the role of journalists in this war, which has also, you mentioned these intentional, probably, attacks on civilian infrastructure, you know, but there's so much evidence of crimes against humanity and genocide, in addition, of course, to war crimes, which are somewhat more common. So I wonder what it's like to work in a massive crime scene as a journalist, when you know some of your work may actually end up as evidence in trials later on down the road. And secondly, the sort of corollary to that, I would like to know how you and other journalists operating in the field are taking care of yourselves sort of emotionally. Since I just know from my own experience how traumatizing secondarily it is to operate in spaces of genocide and atrocity crimes.
No, thank you. Thank you for both of those questions. Well, one thing is that the Ukrainians are taking the issue of prosecuting war crimes and investigating these things very seriously. And I mean, so you see, when we show up into a place that has recently been liberated, you often will see people there who are gathering evidence. There's some independent NGOs as well as the prosecutors' offices from Kyiv are often there, also out there gathering evidence. So in a way, it takes some of the burden off of us and others. So I actually don't really think about it a lot. I really am usually trying to think about telling this individual story about this place. But, you know, if we hear that there was some place that they were torturing people, you know, we try to go and see it and make sure that, you know, we are documenting that as well, which I think will be added to the overall evidence. You know, if you look at a place like Liman, where there was these mass graves on the outskirts of the city, and the Ukrainians were there. They were forensic people who were going through each grave as they exhumed the bodies there, and so, you know, in a way, the problem is so big. I tend to try to focus on one particular story that day and try to tell that story well. But I mean, I do feel like it's important to be here and to be documenting what's happening and to be keeping people engaged with it. You know, I think there is a bit of Ukraine fatigue in the US. I mean, you saw it in the midterm elections. Some people are just, they've had enough of the funding for it, and this has been going on for a long time. It's not exactly clear when or how this is going to end. So I feel like it's important to be telling the stories of people who are living this, and you know, if you spend enough time here or you look enough at this this conflict, it is you know, it's outrageous what that one state can do this to just civilian populations on a regular basis. You know, the idea that you know, the neighboring state can just decide that we're going to just drop a cruise missile in the middle of Venetia and kill some children, and then everyone just goes on like, you know, it's nuts. It's really nuts. And in this one in particular, there's a lot of that going on beyond just armies of men who've decided that they wanted to get out there and do this. There's a lot of this collateral damage that's happening here. And so I feel like that's something that I try to document, but on a smaller scale than some of the grander work that you do. And in terms of taking care of ourselves, I'm not sure we do as good a job of that as we probably should, but they do a really good job of making sure that if you've been there for a month, you rotate out. That right at the very beginning, some people were staying a bit longer than that, and yeah, I think that NPR really recognizes this, and they stress that you need to take some time off. You need to not let this be all consuming. So,
thank you for those thoughtful answers, Jason. That's great. We want to go next over to Phil from political science. So Phil, I'm going to give you the floor.
Great, thanks. And thank you again, Jason, for really invaluable work that you're doing, and just we really appreciate that. So a little bit building off of Elise's question, I'm kind of curious if you can talk a little bit about Ukrainian nationalism and the ways in which the war itself, but also the way the war is being fought, how that has shaped Ukrainian identity, and also in addition to Ukrainian identity, about sort of the ethnic Russians who live particularly in eastern Ukraine, which was part of the motivation or the rhetoric at least that Putin used for this invasion. How have they been impacted, and their view of their identity, how you've seen that change? Just that's a big question, but if you could talk a little bit about identity, that would be fascinating.
Yeah, and it's something that people here are very aware of. So people talk about a lot, and they sort of joke that Ukrainians have never really been able to come together as a nation, and there's really this difficulty, and Putin is the first president to manage to bring Ukrainians together. So they sort of joke that nobody else could do it, but Putin has managed to bring Ukrainians together, and I think it's very true. I mean, I am out talking to people in the East. You'll be in places where everybody's speaking Russian. Pretty much everyone is speaking Russian, but they view themselves as Ukrainians. And I think they view themselves much more as Ukrainians than they used to. This is an area that was part of the Soviet Union. It was, you sort of had the Red Famine after that 1930s. I think it was 1930s. I mean, we've had this conflict between Russia and Ukraine for that goes back for generations and generations and generations. And sometimes people, I think, didn't know where they really belonged or fit in the overall picture. But people say to me that the fact that I speak Russian doesn't make me any more a part of the Russian Federation than the fact that you speak English. That doesn't make you British as an American, right? So they're so people are very much now disconnecting speaking Russian from being Russian, and people here view that I can speak Russian at home and doesn't make me Russian. And people have this much stronger sense of their identity as Ukrainians. I mean, even today, I was talking to a couple with a 12-year-old girl. They were saying that the dad speaks Russian at home. They were both speaking in Ukrainian. It's interesting. Out today, in the middle of Kherson, in this sort of very celebratory atmosphere, almost everybody was speaking Ukrainian, and that's kind of interesting because Kherson is a lot of people speak Russian there. But this couple was saying that he speaks Russian at home, she speaks Ukrainian at home, the mom speaks Ukrainian, dad speaks Russian, and that's just how they do it. It's not a big deal. And I do think that this conflict has driven a sense of Ukrainian identity that wasn't fully coalesced before, and I think this has really made it coalesce.
All right, we're going to do one more panelist question. And then after that, we're going to start pulling some questions from our Q&A function. So if any of our audience members have been thinking of a question that you would really like to ask Jason, please put that in there now, and then we'll try and piece together as many of those as we can in our conversation. But first, I want to go over to Julio from Journalism, Media, and Public Relations for our last question from one of our panelists. So Julio, let me give you the floor.
Thanks, Kate, and thank you, Jason, for joining us and everything that you do. I hope you stay safe.
Thanks.
In the past couple of years, most notably with the pandemic and now the war in Ukraine, misinformation has become more and more of an issue and played more of a role. Can you talk about ways that you deal with that as a journalist, and maybe give us some tips on how to navigate that challenge?
Yeah, no, it's a huge issue, and it's very much an issue here in this conflict. There's a real, very vibrant social media scene here, and there's a lot of content out there, and sometimes it's content and not necessarily information. I mean, people are making things up and throwing it out there, and it gets a lot of attention. And so we find we have to be very careful, particularly about things that we initially come across online, about whether or not they're true. And we try to do that basic journalism thing of making sure that we can get secondary sources, additional sources to confirm these things before we end up running with them. Or it's even more a problem, I think, than it was in the past, in part because things can gain traction on social media in a way that in the past they probably wouldn't. So we try to check in with the governmental sources that we have, with people who are on the ground. But it also is really tough because, just as I was talking about how the occupied territories are cut off on an information infrastructure way, we also, we start hearing things about something happening there, and it's really hard for us to follow up because oftentimes we can't just pick up a phone and call someone in one of these occupied territories. It just logistically isn't possible. They don't have electricity, or their information technology is being routed through Russia, and we just can't communicate with each other. So this has been a tough one here, and particularly when we hear completely some stories that sound too crazy to be true. My translator and I were just debating one of these today, and I won't go into the details about it, just because I don't want to amplify this story, but there was this story and we both had been reading it, and I don't know, I think it might have ended up on Reuters, but we both were like, I don't know. I really don't know about this one. This is like, we definitely wouldn't do that story without, yeah, I'm not going to get into the details of what it was, but it was a very gory story. And we thought that there was some concern that maybe this is not fully sourced. It didn't make a lot of sense. And I think that's actually one of the keys. If it seems like it's just way too crazy, sometimes it's worth stepping back and having a look at it. So yeah, it's something we're very aware of, and something that's a daily challenge for us. As I said, like my translator and I were just debating this on this one particular story today. So
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Jason, you've been so gracious in answering all of our panelists' questions, so thank you. We have a bunch of great questions that have come in through the Q&A chat as well. So if it's okay, we'll go to some of those now. And then if our panelists have other questions that they want to weave in as well, we can also do that. Does that sound good?
That sounds great. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, I feel like we've been asking you a lot of deep and tough questions. So I want to go to a maybe simpler question that we received from one of our audience members. Sarah P asks how you pack for a trip into a war zone. So what's most important for you to bring with you when you're packing for a work assignment like this?
Well, I always have a suitcase that's already sort of like generally packed, and it's got like cables and connectors and things like that. So all the basics, as well as we have setups so that we can run like a 110-volt thing to charge your car out of a cigarette lighter and things like that. The interesting thing is I usually don't cover cold weather places. So like a lot of what I cover has always been, it seems like, in warmer climates. So I didn't pack as well for Ukraine. Ukraine is a difficult one. At least it is right at the moment. It's fairly cold here. So I guess my key is that I bring just 2 pairs of pants, a bunch of shirts. If you have 2 pairs of pants, you're going to have to be washing one while you wear the other one. That's try to be as light as possible is I think my key strategy. So
that's great advice. Probably advice that many of us could use, even not for travel into war zones. So thank you for sharing that with us.
yeah.
We also got a great question. We have a group viewing that's happening upstairs, and our moderator up there let us know that we had a question from Dr. Elisa Di Giovanni, who is affiliated with Holocaust and Genocide Studies and also chair of modern languages here at Keene State. But she was wondering if you've had a chance at all in your reporting or in your work to talk to any Russian soldiers or Russian men who have fled, or maybe just more generally, if you could speak a little bit about who you have access to or who you don't.
Yeah, so it's very much an interesting one in this conflict and I'm well aware of it, that I'm covering the Ukrainian side of this conflict. I have very little access to what's happening in Russia, to Russian soldiers. Under the Geneva Convention, we shouldn't be interviewing Russian soldiers who've been captured. There are places where armies will make people like that available, but the Ukrainians are actually quite careful not to do that, and we wouldn't try. We do have a correspondent. Charles Maines is based in Moscow. He is working under very difficult conditions because there's a new law came into effect pretty much in parallel with this war that makes it a crime to criticize the war effort in any way. And as a matter of fact, early on, you weren't even, I think he might not still even be able to call it a war. He's got very difficult constraints that have been placed on him, but he does make an effort to cover that side of it when there was this conscription drive where President Putin was trying to get 300,000 new draftees into the military. I believe it was in September that got launched. It was very controversial in Russia, and Charles was able to get out and talk to people who were opposed to being drafted, who were being drafted but were really unhappy about it. But it is a divide in terms of what we are able to cover and in this overall conflict. And it's something I recognize that, we are not able to cover the Russian side of this as well as I wish we could. I think it would be really interesting to actually spend some time in some of these areas that like in Donetsk and Luhansk, which kind of broke away in 2014 and have been backed by Moscow, but they basically were operating as independent states, and they are now part of what you see in that red far over on the east in that map that I talked about earlier. But the conflict there started a lot earlier. These are places where there is a lot more of Russian nationalism in those areas, but we simply. Yeah, I don't have access to it, and most of the correspondents who are operating here don't either. Yeah.
Great. Our next question for you is from an alumna, actually, Ali. And it's a little bit similar to a question that Elisa had asked you before, but it's slightly different. So I'm going to ask it anyways. And if you feel like it's the same, you can let us know, but you might have more that you want to say. But Ali says, thanks so much for chatting with us. Obviously, you're there as a journalist, but you're also a human who's witnessing war crimes. And you know that you'll leave at some point while Ukrainians you interact with have to stay. So how do you balance your duty to report as a journalist with the intense emotion that I imagine you face on a day-to-day basis while you're reporting under these conditions? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's tough, like my driver, for instance. He's this 31-year-old guy. He's a professional dancer, does like modern dance, and usually works outside of the country, and he can't leave the country. Men under the age of 60 aren't allowed to leave under martial law. It's not that he necessarily wants to, but he's found himself driving car for me instead of what he'd been doing before. This war has affected people, and that's and his problems are minor compared to many other people's, right? But it's affected everybody. Everyone in Ukraine has been affected by this war. And there's people who have relatives in Russia. Their families have been torn apart as a result of this conflict, which they didn't necessarily, they didn't start, but now their families are torn apart. You have people who are losing loved ones, who are losing children. It is very hard to watch, and it's particularly and the hardest part to watch is people who are not at all involved with the military, who are just civilians who are getting killed out of the blue. One of the things about this, as I mentioned earlier, is that Russia just seems to feel like it's completely legitimate to just launch missiles anywhere across Ukraine whenever it feels like. And more often than not, you end up having collateral damage that's civilians, and seeing that happen to people who didn't have any desire to get involved in this necessarily is really hard. Yeah. So that I think is the hardest thing to watch.
All right, I want to bounce back to Phil because I know he had another question he was hoping to work into our conversation. So Phil, let me give you the floor again.
Great, thank you. From a sort of a big picture standpoint, I'm kind of curious about how you see this war ending. So political scientists, emphasize the need to look for off-ramps in times of conflict and war, but Putin, as we're seeing in the news, he's increasingly backed into a corner, potentially desperate. And, some people are starting to put pressure on the Ukrainian government to, look for ways out, but Ukrainians seem unwilling to compromise, understandably. So, what do you see moving forward? Are there off-ramps left? Is this just the state, this is the state we're going to be in for a while? I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, what the big picture looks like.
Yeah, I think that it is one of the most difficult things about this war at the moment. Putin, his goals from the very beginning were very difficult to sort of grasp and weren't very clear. His talk about denazifying Ukraine and ousting the government from Kyiv. Well, the ousting the government from Kyiv didn't happen. Things are not going well, yet he still controls a significant chunk of the country. The whole South, a good part of the East. Much of that East was already controlled by Moscow-affiliated regimes. And I should point out that with the fall of Kherson, the largest city that they now are occupying that is new this year is Mariupol, which basically they destroyed in order to take it. However, this was a brazen move by Putin. He's unlikely to be willing to just say, oh yeah, forget it, and pull out. And at this point, the Ukrainians, they don't just want him to pull out of this new territory that he's taken. They want Crimea back, which he seized in 2014. And they want him out of those territories in the east called the Donbass, Luhansk, and Donetsk oblasts, which had from 2014 were operating pretty much autonomously. So Ukraine is looking to win back all of the territory that it's lost since 2014. So I don't see a compromise happening quickly or easily. Yeah, I don't see Putin being willing to give up. And at this point, Ukrainians have suffered so much and see this as their last chance to get Crimea back and get the Donbass back, that they don't want to back off at this point either. I do think that, I mean, I find it concerning that Putin might be backed into a corner, because this is the Russian Federation has nuclear weapons. I think that there's the potential, and I'm not saying that it's going to happen, but I think the potential for it happening when Russia is backed into a corner, facing a huge embarrassment. I think you could see, and maybe it won't be nuclear weapons, but I think you could see something fairly dramatic happen, and I find that fairly scary. Yeah, so I don't see any good off-ramps right on the horizon here, which is unfortunate, but that's basically how I see it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Jason, we got a couple of questions from one of our student viewers, which I'm going to pack into one bundle for you to share. But a student whose name is Nathan was curious to know a bit about what kind of brought you into the line of work that you're doing, and being in this position where you're sent on assignment into war zones. So kind of what motivated that, or how did you get to this place where this is the work that you're doing? And then also, have you been in any situations where you felt that your own life has been under threat?
No, thanks for those questions. I mean, well, I was an English major in college, had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I knew I liked to write, and like I worked at the college radio station at the time, but just playing music. I didn't actually do journalism, and I ended up interning at KQED in San Francisco. I was going to San Francisco State at the time, and I just started working in their newsroom, and I loved it. They sent me out a tape recorder, and I started talking to people, and I really liked people's voices. I loved telling stories where you could hear the way people express things and the way words resonated through their body into the mic and came out of the radio. I found that was just a fascinating way to tell stories. So that's how I got started. Started off as an intern. Eventually they hired me as a reporter. I bounced around. I worked in Boston for a while, and ended up, my first job with National Public Radio, the network, was actually as the Africa correspondent, which is a bit of a jump. I got quite lucky, I must confess, to get that jump. But yeah, okay, so as a journalist, you want to tell the big stories, right? I feel like this is one of the biggest stories at the moment, and whichever way this goes, it's going to be consequential. And so, yeah, I enjoy being involved with that. But I also, as I mentioned earlier, I feel like it's important to keep those human stories out there as people are discussing potential peace talks and potential, political settlements and the grain deal and all that. There's human beings behind this, and there's people whose lives have been completely upended as a result of this war. And I want to make sure that I get a chance to make sure that their voices are heard in this global discussion about what's happening. And I mean, I've had a few times when, yeah, there's been some scary moments. It's almost always by accident. You know, you didn't expect this to happen. I mean, the time that I was probably the most dangerous thing. Again, complete accident, and it was people mistook me for a UN peacekeeper. I was in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I had just arrived in Kisangani, which is up on the northern part of the river. And I just gotten in, I just got my driver sorted out. I went to grab some lunch, and I I couldn't find my driver after lunch. Like, I'm walking out, I see this big crowd of people. And unbeknownst to me, a town in the east of the Congo had just been overrun by some militia, and the UN had done nothing to stop the attack. And this crowd was pounding on the doors of the UN compound there. And I kind of came up, and they saw me, and people just started hurling rocks at me, and chased me through the streets. And I took refuge in a church. And that was probably the most dangerous situation I was ever in. We make a real effort to be safe, and it's a good thing about radio. We don't need to be right out there the way the photographers and TV people, what their product is. They need to be right up there on the front line. And for radio, we can hang back a bit. And and I'm happy to do that. I don't feel like I need to be right up there next to the gunfire. So.
Great. Well, Jason, we have about 3 minutes left today, this session has flown by. So I don't know how we got to this point, but I was going to ask one more question, and then I'll probably just take a minute to wrap up from there, if that sounds okay.
Sure.
But we have so many great questions that we won't have time to get to. And I'm sorry to our audience members if we don't get to your question, but we do have Mike Welsh, who teaches at Keene State, and his class across campus are zooming in. So hi class. But they had a question that they wanted to ask you about whether you'll stay with this story until the conflict is over, or what does your life on this work assignment kind of look like going from here?
I mean, I certainly would like to. I was not supposed to be covering this, and I've ended up covering it a lot this year. And when this conflict is actually going to be over is, as I mentioned a bit earlier, really unclear. So all of that is a bit up in the air. I certainly would like to continue to be coming to Ukraine, to be trying to cover this conflict in the months. I hope it's only the months to come. I hate to say it, it probably will be the years to come, but I'm hoping to keep this as something that I can report on.
Well, thank you, Jason. I think I speak for all of us in this Zoom room and for our audience members in just saying we are so grateful to you for making time in the midst of your work assignment internationally to Zoom into our community and to share your expertise. I mean, we're so lucky to be able to have a conversation with someone who's truly a master at his craft in the way that you are. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for being here with us. I also just wanted to say that personally, for me, this is one of the most powerful interdisciplinary events that I think I've ever been part of. It's really cool to see different folks from various disciplines here at Keene State and our students and others chiming in with questions that show the relevance of what's happening in your particular work assignment through all these different lenses, right? So I'm grateful also to be part of a community here at Keene State that values that type of interdisciplinary work and collaboration. So thanks to all of you, our panelists and our audience members as well. Jason, I hope you don't mind my mentioning this, but we also know that Jason and his family are eventually planning to move up closer to our neck of the woods in New Hampshire. And we're hoping that this is going to be just the start of probably a whole series of conversations and encounters with Jason over time. So thank you again. And I think with that, we'll kind of close things out for today, but it's been a very powerful past hour altogether. So with gratitude.
Great. It's my pleasure. Thank you.